Yes, so I'm here with Joti Brar, a leader of the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist. And we're going to have a conversation about world politics and events in Britain as well as around the world. Can you tell me a little bit about the CPGBML?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we have an alphabet soup kind of a name, which is a hereditary, really, of the movement as it was some time ago. All the proper names are taken, basically. But we needed to form a new party because, in fact, the real revolutionary tradition of the communist movement wasn't being upheld by any of the existing parties. So we were stuck with a long-winded name. Actually, we've taken recently, we just call ourselves the Communists these days. And the reason being that there isn't another party that's really seriously active. There certainly is not another party that puts revolutionary change of society at the front and center of what it does. Most other parties call themselves communist, socialist, anything like that, are really talking about a kind of socialism that they envisage being something you get via the current state machine. It's capitalism that's nicer to the working class. That's their idea of socialism. Our understanding of socialism is that you can't solve the problems of the working class without changing the whole basis of the state. That means putting the power in the hands of the working class, putting the productive decisions in the hands of the working class, the means of production, as the Marxists call it, and changing society completely. We can't just take over the existing state and expect it to work for workers. It's been set up to work for capital.
And I recently read an article you wrote about China, where you talked about the Hong Kong protests and what's really behind them. And I understand that, as a Marxist-Leninist organization, your organization supports the People's Republic of China, supports Cuba, supports the really existing socialist countries of the world. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Certainly we do. We support them not only in a kind of dogmatic, because they have the right kind of socialism way. We support them because the fundamental contradiction in the world today is between imperialism and the oppressed countries. And it's very important to recognize that everything that stands against imperialism is on the side of the workers at home here in the imperialist countries. They are fighting our enemy and helping to make our enemy weaker. They're in the same struggle we're in, and we have to combine with them. Lenin was very clear in his teachings about this, and those teachings need to be followed. They absolutely explain how the working class can come to power. Working class can't come to power without recognizing who its allies are, and its allies are anyone, anywhere who's fighting imperialism.
And when you talk about, this common enemy that people in the imperialist countries have with people in the developing world, can you describe this enemy?
So imperialism is the enemy. Imperialism is really capitalism in its final monopolistic stage, where it's broken out of its national boundaries. So capitalism first developed in Western Europe. That's why the Western European countries are the ones, and the USA, that have become so dominant in the world, because they had the advantage of getting there first, and having conquered their home markets and become established and strong there, capital amasses and needs to expand its market in order to keep growing, keep making more profits. The drive to profit is what fuels capitalism. It's not the drive to innovate. It's not the drive to serve the people. It's not a drive to do anything marvelous. It's just a drive to expand itself. Capital needs to get bigger. That's the drive of this entire system. And once you have saturated the home market and you can't expand your market anymore there, you have to go abroad. That's why it's the Western imperialist country, Western European countries, which expanded over the globe and created their empires, the legacy of which we see today. And so that's imperialism. Imperialism is capitalism that has become too big for a national market and expanded. And imperialism seeks domination. That's a fundamental teaching of Marxism, and anybody who looks at the world can see that's absolutely true. Imperialism seeks domination. It talks about democracy, but what it wants is total control. And it wants total control of all resources, all markets, all avenues of exploitation, all workers. It wants to be able to loot at will. And anything that stands in its way, it sees as an affront to its right to exploit and to expand. And so this makes it the enemy of every person around the world who thinks that their resources in their countries should be under their own control, because imperialism says, no, they're not your resources, they're ours. Who do you think you are? You know, we're big, we're powerful, might is right. And I visited Libya in 1999, and saw some of the benefits the Libyan people derived from having an independent government that had a popular leaning, i.e., which thought that it was a good idea to use the country's resources for the benefit of the people. And they really did. The people of Libya had a very civilized, dignified life. And not only that, but they were able to offer support to many other countries that were fighting imperialism or just fighting, you know, backwardness and underdevelopment. So that's what I saw. That was the Libya that I saw. Independent, proud, advanced, and advancing. You know, one of the things that's not talked about the destruction of Libya is how they were trying to diversify their economy. So they had all this oil. And before the revolution in Libya, the king who was there basically was a stooge of BP and other oil companies. And Libyan oil benefited imperialist corporations who sucked the wealth of Libya, and Libya's people were very, very poor. After the revolution, the Green Revolution they called it, when Gaddafi's government came to power, the people benefited from the oil. But the government was very aware that it's not good to have an economy that's just based on one commodity. You're at the mercy of the world market. All sorts of problems can come to you from that. It's not a sustainable way. And also it can run out one of these days, right? But Libya was involved in trying to diversify its economy. And they had a fantastic project they were building, which they talked to us about, and they showed us the plans. And by the time of the bombing campaign, 12 years later, it had been sort of 90% realized. It was coming to fruition. It was called the Great Man-Made River Project. And they were greening the desert. They were building, there's a huge amount of water underneath the desert in Libya. And they were building aquifers to bring that water to the surface and to create farmland, bring back agriculture to Libya. And they were trying to also, you know, build some industrial base, all the rest of it. All of that has been absolutely smashed by the bombing.
Wow. Now, back to China. When I talk to people in the United States about China, and I point to China and the successes of socialism there, I often get this response, well, everyone knows China's capitalist, right? They've got billionaires there, there are private companies, so you can't point to China as an example of a successful socialist society. Now, I have my response when I talk to people, but what do you say when people say that to you?
So there is a contradiction, I think, between the fact that China had a socialist revolution and China now has a very marketized economy. So there are two separate issues at stake. One of them is China still socialist or not? And, you know, for us Marxists, it's an important question to understand. The other one is, should you support China? Now, to me, they're separate questions. I've already talked to you about anti-imperialism. China, without trying to be hostile, China tries very hard not to provoke anybody, not to upset anybody, to show that it wants to be friendly and have cooperative relations. But by existing as a large, powerful, independent country that doesn't allow the US, Britain, France, Germany to freely loot its resources, to freely exploit its people, they can come and make money, and they have made huge profits out of using Chinese labor, but they can't just loot the country. That's what they see as their right. Anything that gets in the way of that, to them, is an enemy. So even though China tries to present itself as being non-threatening, non-aggressive, cooperative, the imperialists can't help but see it as an enemy. And in the fact that it is a block on imperialist looting of the planet, it is their enemy. I mean, the imperialists are right in that. It's not aggressive. It's not trying to impinge on them, but it sort of does impinge just by existing. So from the point of view of that alone, there's more than enough reason to defend China. China's not aggressing anybody. China's not looting anybody. China offers friendly terms of trade. China offers what they call win-win. You know, it brings development to countries. Ever since the revolution and still to today, China has helped many countries around the world to develop infrastructure, technology, skills. And when it gives loans to other countries, it does it on a very friendly rate. It's a fraternal assistance type of, you know, development, rather than the imperialist type, which is to control the politics and the economy of any country it does any business with, so that, you know, all the benefit goes to the imperialists and almost nothing to the countries which are hoping to get something out of the relationship. China certainly had a socialist revolution. It built a base using a planned socialist economy. My view is that everything China has achieved has been on the basis of that, on the basis of having a Marxist leadership that was able to lead its revolution, on the basis of its planned economy in the early days that laid down its industrial base. My view of market socialism is, to be honest, there's no such thing. A socialist country might decide to use the market for various reasons, of pressure from outside or needing to catch up, or whatever they think it's going to be helpful for, but it's always a danger. Commodity production, capitalist production creates capitalists. A capitalist class, bourgeois relations within society, commodity relations, they are going to undermine socialism. They cannot but undermine socialism. And then so you have a contradiction within China. You hope very much that the Chinese Communist Party is aware of this and is dealing with this. One class or the other has to win. Either the working class is in charge or the bourgeoisie is in charge. China has this contradictory situation where they have a People's Party, and yet they also have a rising and growing bourgeoisie and a growing section of their economy, which is a market economy. And these things cannot but come into contradiction.
I want to get back to Britain now. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, rising figure. We hear about him in the United States, that he's accused of being an anti-Semite. We hear him described as being a hardline communist. What is the position of your organization? How do you view Jeremy Corbyn?
I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it, that the ruling class has taken such umbrage to somebody who is really a quite mildly left-wing social democrat. Our view is, of course, he's not a Marxist. He's nothing. He'd never claimed to be a Marxist. I mean, you know, it's a kind of stupid thing to say. Really, I think what makes him seem so dangerous to the ruling class is actually the fact that we're in the midst of a really deep economic crisis. So that even a quite mildly social democratic platform of a little bit of nationalisation, a little bit more to the workers than you're currently giving. I mean, he's not asking to have everything back that the workers have had after the Second World War. He's just saying a little bit of it should come back. It's not really nice, all this austerity. But the problem is, austerity is not a policy of the nasty party. In our country, a lot of the left tries to say that austerity is a political choice made by Tories who are nasty, and Labour are nice and they won't do austerity because they choose not to. This is not an accurate reflection of reality. The reality is austerity comes not because the ruling class are horrible and they hate the poor, but because there's a crisis. And in order to survive the crisis, the capitalists have to pass the burden to the poor. That is the same whether or not Labour or the Conservatives are in power. This is not a question of ideology. It's a question of economic necessity. And it's also a question of class forces. If the working class is not organised and able to push back against austerity, it will get austerity no matter who is in power. So we have this presentation of Jeremy Corbyn, because he says a few things about austerity not being very nice, that he's a great Marxist. His platform, if you examine it, is not the most left-wing platform of any leader we've ever had in Britain since the Second World War. If it was implemented, it wouldn't be the most, you know, left-wing reality we've ever had. We've had much more radical things, but at that time, after the Second World War, the British working class movement was strong. There was a huge communist movement in Britain, but also worldwide. You know, the communists after the Second World War had the capitalists on the run. Imperialism was weak. The workers were strong. They were able to make huge demands. And in fact, the capitalists saw if they didn't cede some of those demands, they would have revolution on their hands. So it was a peace deal to say, no, you can have the advantages of socialism without a revolution. Don't worry, look, we'll give you the things that you're worried about, and you don't need to make a revolution. And so we got them. And then as the working class was lulled to sleep, and as the crisis came back after the war, these things have been slowly, surely taken away. And particularly, you notice, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the acceleration of the dismantling of the welfare states across Western Europe.
Yeah, the way you talk, I mean, you're a communist, and the language that you use is very different than what we hear in kind of left circles nowadays, and be that in the United States or in Britain. I wanted to ask you, to then touch on a couple issues. So it seems like, in the United States, among people who describe themselves as left or socialist or progressive, there's this feeling that Donald Trump is a fascist, or there's this feeling that the Brexit movement in the UK is fascist. And so therefore, we need to do everything we can to stop the fascism. They talk about the new right in Europe, populism. This is all fascism. So we have to do everything we can to stop this fascist current. That doesn't seem to be your orientation. It's not my orientation either, but can you describe how you would differ from forces that would make things sound that way or frame things that way?
Yeah, sure. I mean, fascism, like communism, like Marxism, like imperialism, these are words that have a meaning. And the problem with so many on the left is they have adopted some vocabulary, but they have divorced it from meaning, which is also something that you see throughout bourgeois politics these days, that words become divorced from their meanings. But if you're a socialist, a real socialist, you have to treat words scientifically. Fascism is something very particular. It is not what Donald Trump represents, as far as we're concerned. It's certainly not Brexit represents. In fact, we view the election of Donald Trump and the Brexit referendum in a similar way, that they are both products of the crisis. They are both products of this drive to austerity and war, which has really left large numbers of workers in the US, in Britain, very poor, disenfranchised, angry, left behind. It started with the dismantling of the welfare state started several decades ago in this country. And you don't have a welfare state per se in the US, but definitely benefits to workers, pay to workers started to go down, and industrial jobs were being lost. Now, workers have been told for so long the reason they lose industrial jobs is immigrants come and take them. The reality is that before, even without any immigrants coming into the country, capital is being exported to where it can work harder, to where jobs, where wages are lower, what's the word I'm looking for? Regulation is less, etc. Taxation is less, blah, blah, blah. Capital is footloose. Capital goes wherever it can make the most profit, and it doesn't care how many workers it leaves unemployed behind it. So workers have been misdirected for a long time about the problem of unemployment and whose fault it is. We've been encouraged to blame each other for the problems of the system. With Donald Trump, with Brexit, you are seeing the result of decades of jobs leaving the country, austerity, war, leaving people feeling like they are just getting poorer and poorer and nobody's representing them. And they watch politics going on in your country and in my country for a long time. Ordinary people have seen politicians on both sides of the alleged spectrum, which is not a spectrum, right? They all have essentially the same policies. And workers in Britain certainly can see the truth of what our party's slogan is: Labour, Tory, same old story. And most workers here have started to understand some time back that makes no difference who you vote for. The policies are the same. The result is the same. It's more crap for the working class. And, everything is about what business needs. These wars, we don't want them, ever since that massive demonstration against the Iraq War, 2003, and even as 2 million people were on the streets of London, the bombers were flying overhead. You know, Blair knew he didn't have to pay any attention to that demonstration. And he was right, because the leadership made sure that there was no meaningful action on the part of those people. They came, they went, and then each year they'd come again, but there would be fewer of them because there was kind of no point to it. But these lessons do slowly come home to workers. You know, this so-called democracy isn't working for us. The fabulous thing, from my perspective, about the Brexit vote is to see the lengths that the ruling class is going to, or the majority section of the ruling class is going to overturn it, is a fantastic education for workers in just how much of a sham our so-called democracy is. You know, Britain has the mother of all democracies, the mother of all parliaments. We're always made to feel very superior about the fact that we know how to do democracy. We've been doing it the longest. We're very, very good at it, all this nonsense. So British workers have had that prejudice that, you know, our democracy works. Well, now they've had 3 years having made a vote, watching their so-called representatives argue about how to overturn that vote. And while they're arguing about how to overturn it, they're also not doing anything else. There's no room, there's no bandwidth amongst our political class for anything except how to stop Brexit. But the other thing I just wanted to get back to quickly, sorry, I'm talking a long time. The other thing I quickly wanted to get back to about where these votes come from is, again, they're product of the crisis. The ruling class in your country and in my country is divided. It's divided because of the crisis. It's divided over the best strategy for surviving the crisis. So in the US, in Britain, you have a dominant section of the ruling class, the big, more powerful financial oligarchy, banking, armaments, oil. They want more expansion, more war, more of the same that we've had. What people are calling neoliberal. I don't really go for these labels, but people tend to understand that, the neoliberal type of, you know, just keep expanding, keep dominating everywhere. And that's the way to ride it out, just suppress everybody else. But there's a smaller section within the ruling class, within the bourgeoisie, in the US and in Britain the same, and you'll see it in every capitalist country around the world at the moment. There's a section that says, no, the way to survive is stop looking outside our borders, stop spending money on wars. You know, these people can never quite understand that the investment pays off with the war. You know, they just see it as, oh, well, you're just spending money. How silly, don't spend money. Because they're not directly maybe in the line of the payback from the wars. So to them, it's just taxation and they're not getting a payback. Of course, they're not the section of the ruling class that gets the payback, right? But the smaller business people, the smaller bourgeois tend to say, no, we'll just close down our borders. We'll take care of our own workers. We'll stop exporting jobs. Maybe we'll protect our markets, tariffs, you know, the trade war approach. Of course, in the end, neither section has a formula that works. You know, the problem is capitalism. The problem is a crisis that's built into capitalism, overproduction of goods on the world capitalist market, with impoverishment of the mass of the workers who can't buy the goods. That's the problem, and none of them can solve it. But they argue with each other about how to solve it, and the deeper the crisis gets, the more they're arguing. And this makes them weak. It makes them less able to control the narrative because they're divided about what the narrative should be, and therefore less able to control the workers. And so in Britain, the ruling class was divided over Brexit. The majority of the ruling class didn't want Brexit to happen. They allowed the referendum kind of by accident. They got a bit jostled into it, but they thought that's okay, they can win it. They're used to getting their way in elections. Unfortunately, they didn't reckon with the fact that huge numbers of British people are really so angry. They hadn't counted them. They got used to being able to ignore them, these people. They hadn't reckoned with the fact that a referendum is very different to your standard election. That referendum, Caleb, was the first time in my life, and I'm not that young anymore, where I've had an actual say in something, because it was a yes-no question that really affected something meaningful, where every single vote counted. It wasn't done by area. It wasn't done yes, no, first past the post, here, there, you know, between two options that didn't mean, that basically meant the same thing. You know, most of the elections I've ever been eligible to vote for were utterly uninteresting to me, you know, in terms of I couldn't really make any difference. The, you know, the candidates don't represent, you know, anything like what I'm interested in. And first past the post means basically there's only two people who have got in with any chance of winning, and, you know, all the rest of it. And then the, you know, the way they organize the areas of who votes for what. But this was nationwide, one question, every vote counts. And the workers are not stupid. They saw that. We had the highest turnout we've had in a very long time for any kind of election for that referendum, because people saw they could, their vote would count and they could actually make a difference to something. And they felt so many people voted on the basis of, we do not want this status quo, anger. Change anything, we don't care, because what we've got is going down and down and down. Poverty is getting worse. I mean, I don't know if you know, but 10% now of workers in Britain are what they call food insecure. And that is a shocking, shocking statistic to a country like ours that's had the welfare state in place for so long, to find that now people are going hungry, homeless, kids turning up at school who don't get breakfast, you know, kids sleeping in B&Bs for years at a time because they can't get a home. Not to mention, I mean, you know, it's worse in the States, I know, that type of thing, but for a country like Britain, it's really shocking to see what's happening to the poor.
What's driving this new level of poverty? What's behind it?
It's austerity and the destruction of the welfare state. We used to have so there are fewer jobs, and the jobs that there are, we keep being told that we have a jobs recovery and there's loads of work. But actually, if you look at the type of work now, it's overwhelmingly minimum wage, 0-hour contracts, which means totally flexible. So officially you're employed, but in reality, you never know how many hours you're going to work. You just have to be available all the time. And the money is poverty pay. You know, we have nurses using food banks because they don't have enough money to feed their children. You know, and people are so close to the disaster line now. You know, so many people just don't have any cushion whatsoever. There's no housing security that people used to have. Rents have become, because of the sell-off of social housing, rents have become so high that, you know, it's increasingly people are running and running. People work very hard just to live on the poverty line. You know, this is quite a new phenomenon, and this is something that really came since 2008, this real plunge in people's living standards, and it's getting worse year on year.
Now, back to what I was asking you about before, about kind of distinguishing yourself as a communist from the mainstream of the left. I noticed that your political organization has taken quite a stand on the transgenderism debate. Can you talk about that position? Sure.
I mean, essentially, our view is, and it's not about people. We're not against a trans person. It's the ideology that's being pushed on people that says you are what you think you are. Now, this is total idealism. Idealism in the philosophical sense of the opposite of materialism. It says, I think, therefore I am. Whatever I think, that's reality. Now, as a Marxist, we have to uphold the idea that, or the reality, that material reality is real and is the basis of our ideas. A Marxist says, first there's reality, then our brain interprets reality and gets ideas. An idealist says, no, first there's the idea, and then the idea produces reality. Now, life teaches us that materialism is true. Materialism can be tested by science, by living. Idealism, you know, is a human construct. It's what makes gods, okay? This transgender ideology is pure idealism. It says, if I feel something, it's true. We've all got our own reality. We've all got our own way of, now, of course, we all have our own feelings. Yes, can't dispute that. But your feelings are a reflection of something. Your feelings come from somewhere. We would say that material reality exists, and sexual differences between men and women exist. They're not imaginary. They're not a societal construct. You know, the transgender ideologists, and I do want to keep making this clear, we're not talking about individuals. We're talking about those who push an ideology. So, you know, before I start getting accused of hate speech, this is about ideas. This is a rational debate about ideas. It's not me hating anybody, okay? But the people who push this transgender ideology have tried to make a confusion and say that gender is something different to sex. It isn't. They're talking about gender stereotypes. So a gender stereotype is something that a society has, and some of it may reflect reality and some of it may not. Some of it may reflect the history, the class basis, whatever, of that particular society. Some of it may reflect some reality. You know, we have a stereotype that women's hands are more gentle. Well, in fact, that's based in reality, because women have twice as many sense receptors in their hands than men. There's a biological reason for that. You know, we are biologically designed to carry and to feed and to nurture babies. So it makes sense for us to have very sensitive hands. Babies are very delicate. You know, that is not a stereotype that I've, you know, just made up to oppress men or women with. It's a biological fact. You know, biological facts don't oppress us. They're things we need to learn how to recognize and live with. Freedom, Marxists say, is the appreciation of necessity. You know, it's a reality that women have babies and men have penises. And, you know, the idea that you can say that saying these things is oppressive, repressive, is pushing stereotypes is nonsense. One of the things that really upsets me as a woman, if I can say those loaded words, is that the transgender ideologues they claim to be fighting stereotypes. In fact, they push the most heinous stereotypes of femininity and masculinity. And they just say, if you don't fit into the one you were born into, pick the other one. That's not fighting a stereotype, that's accepting it wholesale. How many transgender women, I get confused, excuse me, about which way around I'm supposed to say it, but, you know, a man who claims to be a woman, how many of those people have you seen just looking like an ordinary working class woman? They feel the need to do a whole glammed up cleavage, high heels, lipstick, like a very sexualized, stereotypical idea of womanhood. Us ordinary born women, most of us are not interested in any of that. That is quite oppressive to women. That look that they go for is a look that we'll be happy to see disappear into history, and they're kind of perpetuating it.
Well, I wanted to ask you, as you made reference to that, you also talked about, you know, being accused of hate speech. And I've noticed increasingly there is a lot less tolerance for different views in left circles. I mean, just everything you've said here would be grounds to get you banned from various left-wing conventions or gatherings. I mean, you know, I've even heard people advocate violence against people who state such things. And what's going on in left circles where there's an atmosphere where it's saying the kind of things that you just said it's not acceptable?
Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? I mean, what we're really seeing today is the culmination of 40 years of identity politics wheedling its way into the working class movement, so that particularly the more privileged sections who go to universities and are influenced by the academics, which is where, you know, lots of people from the Black nationalist movement, from the women's liberation movement, the bourgeois feminists, ended up in academia. And they have created these disciplines, you know, feminism, I don't know what you would call the Black nationalist type of versions, but, you know, they've created these disciplines where they, you know, look at sex, sexuality, color in a very liberal way, but it's presented to, you know, better off educated workers as left-wing consciousness. It isn't left-wing, it's not Marxist. It's got nothing to do with the class struggle for socialism. It is a way of diverting that struggle down kind of navel-gazing, academic, very liberal, bourgeois liberal paths. Sorry, what were you asking me to say?
Oh, just about the fact that in left spaces, if you express opinions like the one you just did, you can often be, removed, told you're not welcome, maybe even violently attacked. Like, why is this atmosphere of intolerance for different perspectives being fomented?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Why has it been fomented? I mean, clearly, what it does is stop people from feeling able to express differing views. Mm-hmm. So that's very useful to imperialism. If you look at it, that these views are inimical, they undermine the ability to mobilize people on a class basis because they divide people, constantly dividing workers against each other into smaller and smaller groups of self-identifying this, that, or the other. And you can't really unite with anyone else. You can only fight for your one-point program. That's useful to imperialism. It's useful to capitalism to divert and divide workers that way. And if you create an atmosphere where the people who are opposing this are accused of hate speech, then very quickly you make it very difficult for a reasonable debate to happen about why these ideas are dangerous. So if you're the ruling class and your system is going through a crisis and you're worried about the ability of the workers to get together and fight you, then it makes sense for you to push anything and everything that will stop them from getting together. And essentially, that's what identity politics of every kind do. They divide the workers against one another. They have whites blaming blacks, blacks blaming whites. They have women blaming men instead of getting together as working class people against the system.
The first time I ever met any comrades from your organization was in 2013 at the World Festival of Youth and Students in Ecuador. And that festival, which I attended, was very meaningful for me. I learned a lot, and I really started to contrast the Marxist-Leninists and communists around the world with the Western leftists and the leftists from countries like Britain and the United States. One thing I noticed is, if you go to the developing world, there are very few Trotskyists, and I know your organization has taken a very strong stand against Trotskyism. Why is it there's such a prevalence of Trotskyism in the first world, but not in the developing world? What's that about?
Fundamentally, Trotskyism is a petty bourgeois, is an imperialist ideology. From Trotsky himself down to Trotsky's followers today, if you look at their position on every question, they have a way of taking the imperialist position and dressing it up with revolutionary words. You will never find a Trotskyist on the side of a national liberation movement. They've always got a reason for dismissing it, and the reason sounds very revolutionary. They'll dismiss the leaders of the Palestinian struggle or the Irish struggle or the Syrian struggle as bourgeois. Oh, they're bourgeois. We can't support them. They're bourgeois. We must keep our hands clean for the perfect socialist. The result of it is they're on the same side as the imperialists, denouncing the leaders who are actually on the front line struggling imperialism. They claim, in the name of the working class, in the name of Marxism, it's not real Marxism. In the name of Marxism, they claim that unless you can agree with every single thing about the program and the orientation of a movement, you mustn't give it support. Well, that is the imperialists' wet dream. That's their recipe for division. The basis of working class organization is premised on disagreement. You cannot put hundreds of thousands of people together in one organization, expect them to agree with each other on everything. It's never going to happen. You can't do that. You can't imagine you're going to do that. You have to have a program around which you organize, agree to disagree about lots of things, agree that you can follow the program, even if some of the points which are not the most important points you don't agree with. You have to learn how to be in a minority. That means putting your ego aside and saying it's not all about me, it's about the movement. How do you get from capitalism to socialism? You have to organize a huge force. You have to be able to work in a single direction with a whole load of other people. Now, the workers at this point in time, when they're demoralized, they've had no decent leadership for such a long time, they don't understand these very simple questions at this present time, but they will come to understand them again. Our ruling class does understand it. Our ruling class is terrified of the potential power of the working class when they actually start to get together. You know, our party understands that you put Marxism together with the masses and you have an unstoppable force. It's the reason why there is a Chinese wall around our party. As far as the media is concerned, we do not exist. To give us any oxygen would be a terrible thing as far as the ruling class is concerned, and it makes damn sure that it doesn't. We're not on the spectrum. We don't exist. There's no communists in Britain as far as, you know, the ruling class is concerned in their media.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's a presentation you gave some years back, which I've watched on YouTube, in which you talk about the October Revolution and what it means to your generation. And one of the things you point to is, you know, how it has just been kind of erased from history, that in the 1930s, with the 5-year economic plans, real economic miracles happened in the Soviet Union, and a whole country was just transformed into just an industrial superpower with socialist methods. And you articulate that very well. And it seems like this is just how the media is. I mean, things that are inconvenient to this narrative that Western capitalism is the best system ever just kind of get, you know, omitted. Can you talk about that a little bit and talk about you know, the achievements of socialism around the world?
Sure. I mean, those achievements are very real. And they are the reason why the name of Joseph Stalin, for example, and in particular, is made into such a swear word. He is held up as the ultimate bogeyman because he was in the leading position in the country that did the most to prove what socialism is capable of. I mean, under the leadership of Lenin and then Stalin, and obviously Stalin's period at the leadership after the revolution was much longer. So he is the one who is uniquely associated with the Soviet period of socialist construction. And my gosh, there is nothing like it in all of human history. That's my belief, that nothing comes close to what the Soviets achieved when they completely implemented Marxism across the board in every field. The Soviet Union took, you know, position after position. They emancipated women, not just in law, but in reality, by creating all of the support structures that meant women were able to really be in the workplace, you know, creches, kindergartens, public laundries, public dining rooms, all the things that relieve women of the extra burdens that are put on them and enable them to take their place in productive life and social life. You know, the healthcare services they created, but the scientific base, the arts that flourished in that period are, you know, any part of life that you look into, you will find something phenomenal that the Soviet Union did in that area of life. And so that is hidden from us. We have a huge media campaign to tell us that, you know, life in the Soviet Union is just depressing, terrible, it's just gulags and, you know, misery and grayness and no personality and no fun. But you only have to ask somebody who's lived through, you know, any of that period, what it was like, or to read the literature that came out of it, of people's experiences, to see what a joyful and inspiring time it must have been to live through. So it's very important to our rulers to keep this from us and to denigrate the leaders of that building. They want to demoralize us. They don't want us to believe there's an alternative. Okay, they say to us, there's adverts on Twitter right now from the Financial Times, which is the mouthpiece of Britain's ruling class, talking about capitalism needs a reset. So they're recognizing the fact that there's huge dissatisfaction with capitalism. And they'll even, since 2008, they'll even use the word capitalism. Okay, capitalism, it's not perfect. Let's all read Marx and realize that, you know, oh, it's not so great. But read our version of Marx. Our version of Marx is he didn't know what, he made a good critique and he's worth listening to, but he's one of many people and he didn't have any solutions. It's a shame, isn't it? There's not really a solution. Let's all just discuss what we can do and feel sad about it and wait for better times. They recognize that people are angry and there's some ability to voice discontent with capitalism, so long as you don't imagine there's a solution. If you're able to say, no, there is a solution, we've seen it working, we have seen Marxism combine with the masses to make successful revolutions in many countries, not just one, many. Marxism plus the masses, you can have a successful revolution. Not only that, we have seen successful implementation of economic planning, of a planned economy under socialism, where life gets better for ordinary people and it works. This they do not want us to know. They are terrified that we will realize that workers can do without capitalists. Capitalists can't do without workers. Workers can do without capitalists. This is a lesson they don't want us to learn.
Yeah. No, I know the Wobblies, the IWW in the United States, they used to chant, "We don't need the bosses need us." That was their articulation of what you just said there. Now, in that presentation you gave a few years back, you talked about how you have a degree in music. And it was interesting to me because when I go to international communist gatherings, I often will hear, choirs and musical performers from socialist countries, and they'll perform classical music, Bach, Beethoven, Shostakovich. And in left circles in the West, or I should say left in quotations, there's almost, in a way, there's almost this feeling that that kind of music is not acceptable, right? We should be listening to rock and roll, we should be listening to jazz, but this classical music, that's, old, crusty, white music that we don't want. Can you talk about, the socialist approach to art and music and aesthetics, and why is it that I remember being at this festival and hearing the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, their choir perform like the music of Italian opera from centuries past and such. Can you talk about the difference in approach to aesthetics among the Marxist-Leninist current that you represent versus the mainstream left?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we've really had a number done on us. In fact, workers in the capitalist countries, and particularly in the imperialist countries, when it comes to culture. We have had our culture commoditized, taken away from us, and then sold back to us. What really makes me very sad is to see, in Britain certainly, with the welfare state, classical music and musical and arts education in general, whether it's theatre or art or music, dance, were opened up to the working classes and they embraced it. And when I was young, quite a long time ago now, that was still the case. I had a musical education that started off, at least, for free in my local school, and my parents didn't have to be involved, they didn't have to pay. It just happened inside the school gates. There were music teachers there, and I had my first violin lessons when I was 5, for free in my class, in my school.
Wow.
Exactly. And that set me on the road of a musical education. By the time I was 9 or 10, it was seen that I was good enough to my parents could see they were justified in trying to get money together to give me, better lessons or, in a different place, whatever. But, if they hadn't been able to afford it, there were subsidies to help me to carry on to a higher level. What's really sad to me now is that's all been decimated. The working class has almost no access to musical education now. The number of kids who get to learn music in a meaningful way in state schools is negligible, absolutely negligible. It's kind of almost, there's a tiny little bit of availability now, but you have to pay, and the lessons are, so to most people that stops them having them all together, but then, they're short and small, and it's not enough to actually get to grips with the instrument. So mostly what the kids learn is they're not interested. It's boring. It's hard work. They're not given enough to really get to grips with it. It's like the way my daughter was learning French in primary school, which was like half an hour every other week or something. I mean, you can't learn it on that basis. So it's kind of a little tokenistic bit is left, but it's not meaningful. And we are losing tremendously from that. Arts, music, dance, they're fundamental to human beings, actually. There's no human culture that doesn't have music, dance at the heart of it. People use music and dance and song to express themselves and to celebrate together. And with the breakdown of community and the destruction of our educational facilities, people are increasingly isolated and devoid of ability to come together and express those things in that really human way. I think the arts are very fundamental to any kind of society. The really sad thing as well that's been pushed on us is this idea that, oh, it's for posh people, it's for the elite. Classical music is something European or Western, and therefore if you're progressive you shouldn't be interested in it, because who wants to be Eurocentric? But this is the way that Marxism itself is dismissed, right? You know, the pinnacle of human knowledge and understanding to this point, as far as I'm concerned, is Marxist science. Now, the fact that it came from Europe shouldn't stop us from appreciating that it represents the liberation for all of humanity. You know, human knowledge is human knowledge. It doesn't matter where it started. All human knowledge rests on human knowledge that's gone before. The European Renaissance rested on, you know, the work that was done in the Arab world. That rested on, you know, older work from Asia as well as from Greece and Rome. So human knowledge is cumulative, and it's the property of all of humanity. And this idea that Marxism is Eurocentric, so if you're not white and European, you shouldn't listen to Marx, that's a way of cutting us off from our heritage and from our ability to liberate ourselves. It's keeping us stupid. Now, when it comes to classical music, my view is it belongs to everybody. It's a high achievement of humanity, and we should cherish it. The Bolsheviks were brilliant at understanding things like that. With ballet, with music, with literature, they said, we must take what's best from the societies that went before us and build on them. We must popularize them and bring them to the masses. The Soviets had wonderful programs of education in music, in dance, for the working classes. They truly democratized the arts, opened them up to such a wide field of participation and audience. Even up until the 1980s, you could go to the Bolshoi Ballet for hardly any money. It was a working class thing to do, to go to the ballet. Now that sounds weird to us, right? We're used to it being something that costs 100 quid and you have to dress up in fancy clothes, and it's something that you don't particularly understand. You don't really know what it means, what they're doing on the stage. Well, you know, that's because the art isn't produced for us or by us. But the reality is that by democratizing not only the access, but also the content, socialist realism was about taking the best of the arts and then using them to express the desires and the aspirations of the workers, and to contribute to the revolutionary development, the social development of society. So they were part of the building of socialism. They were talking to the workers about things the workers understood, helping to reinforce the qualities that the new society needed, you know. So they really played a part in building socialism, and they were valued by working people. But the idea that we should stay away from classical music because it was produced in Western Europe, I think is a nonsensical one.
Okay, and I guess one last question I have then. Does your party plan to stand in elections? Do you participate in the electoral process?
So we have no problem with standing in elections. We take the Leninist view that it's not going to get us to power, but it's a platform for talking politics to people. And also, if you ever happen to get a representative inside Parliament, it's the perfect way to expose the workings of Parliament. That's what a communist should do in a Parliament. A communist in Parliament shouldn't think their job is to run capitalism, right? They should be using the platform to show the workers this democracy is not for you. This setup doesn't serve you. It's to help people come to that understanding who maybe hadn't realized it before. But at this point in time, the way that the British parliamentary system is set up makes it, the bar is very high for entry. It's very hard to find a name you can register that they'll accept. You know, there's one Communist Party already registered, so we can't call ourselves communist in any way. We have to come up with new names, all the rest of it. The process of registering is very difficult, very expensive. They demand all kinds of information about your accounts and your membership, and all, you know, it's quite prohibitive, difficult. There's a lot of hurdles in the way. On top of that, you have to pay a large deposit to stand in just one seat. I mean, there's, you know, God, 600 odd seats in Britain. To stand in just one of them, you have to pay a large deposit. If you don't get a certain percentage of the vote, you don't get that deposit back. So the whole system's very rigged in favor of the big parties. There's a high bar of entry, basically. We don't have a thing, you know, a principle against standing in elections. You know, anytime we're able to participate, we will. But, you know, there's a lot of barriers. We're a small party, so we also have to think about how we use our resources, and at any particular time, what's the best impact we can get, you know.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure you've given my viewers quite a lot to think about, and I do appreciate it. It was a very wide-ranging conversation, so I'm glad you took the time to have a chat with us. I really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Yes.